This course is called Design, Creation of Artifacts in Society. Now, I guess technically, design doesn't actually create the artifact. Design is an integral part of an overall system through which first a gap in the user experience is sensed, and then a plan for an artifact is created. That's the design part. And then some production process is usually required to transform that plan into an artifact itself. So for instance, in the case of the Xylus ice cream scoop, the designer began with some problem, some challenge with the existing solutions, created probably some drawings or some computer models of a desired solution, and then there's a production process that produces the artifact itself. One of the key elements of this course is to deliver a process for doing design. Most of us are interested in actually being able to solve problems, to be able to actually address gaps in the user experience. And it isn't really all that helpful to just say that design is conceiving and giving form to artifacts that solve problems. We want to know how to actually do that. So what I want to do is I want to lay out for you a design process that gets us from A to B, that gets us from the gap in the user experience through to a plan for an artifact that can actually solve the problem. Now, the design process, the process that I'm going to articulate to you, really has its roots in the Shewhart quality improvement process, which sometimes goes by the name PDCA cycle or Plan, Do, Check, Act. And that process is one that has been used in quality improvement and process improvement for more than 50 years. And in many ways, that's the root of that's the foundation of the design process that I'm going to describe for you. And if you really think about it, it may even go back to the scientific method as articulated by Francis Bacon. So the basic idea behind the design process is that if we were to break out that piece of that overall system that transforms gap into artifact, the design portion of that has 4 pieces, or I think it's useful to think about it as having 4 pieces. Now the first piece is kind of easy, which is that basically you have to at some point sense that there is a gap, recognize that there is a problem. Now sensing the gap is somewhat self-evident. You as the user or you as the designer are going to experience some discomfort, pain, lack of satisfaction around some element of the user experience, and that's going to give rise to the design challenge. Now, there is certainly some skill involved in sensing gaps, in finding needs, in identifying problems in the world, but I'm going to put that aside for a moment, and I'm going to focus on the remaining 3 steps in the design process. And those 3 steps are define the problem, explore alternatives, and select a plan. Let me take the 3 main steps in the design process and illustrate them with an example. If we go back to the ice cream scoop example, let's start with define problem. Probably in the case of the Xylus designer, there was some kind of existing solution. This scoop is was the dominant commercial design, say for the past 10 years or so. And the problem definition phase of the design process is really concerned with what are the central elements of the gap here in the user experience. Is the problem ergonomic? That is, does it relate to wrist strain? Is the problem aesthetic? People think these are ugly or look unsanitary. Is the problem sanitation? Is there a problem with disinfecting the ice cream scoops? Is the problem the aesthetic of the scoop itself, the form that the ice cream takes on? Is the problem production cost? Maybe the existing solutions are too expensive. The problem definition phase tries to characterize the nature of the gap in a way that the designer can internalize what the problem is that's to be solved. Now, you'll rarely get it right, but problem definition is really about trying to figure out, before you embark on an exploration process, of what really is the problem. What's the gap you're trying to close? Now, the next step, exploring alternatives. The goal here is to look under every rock, to look behind every bush, and to make sure that you have a complete map of the landscape of possibilities, that you know what all the alternatives are. And once you know them, then you can make an informed choice. But in general, those alternatives in design are not laid out in front of you. You actually have to do some hard work to go look for the alternatives, to go unearth the alternatives, to generate the alternatives. And in many ways, that's the hardest part and the hallmark of design, which is that divergent thinking about what are all the different ways that we could address the challenge. So in the case of the ice cream scoop, if we think about the exploration challenge, you really want to think about what are all the different ways that you could form a scoop of ice cream. It might involve shaving, it might involve molding, it might involve cutting like a cookie cutter, it might involve working with a preformed log or cylinder of ice cream that's part of the packaging. And those would just be the alternatives related to forming the ball or forming the serving of ice cream. There would also be alternatives related to the interface or the interaction between the hand and the handle. There would be alternatives related to how you prevent sticking and enable the release of the scoop. And there would be alternatives related to the aesthetics, surface finishes, and ways that you clean the ice cream scoop. So you can hopefully understand that exploration is fundamentally divergent, and its goal is to unearth all of the possibilities, or as many of the possibilities as possible, so that you understand where you can go, what the best solutions might look like, and have really eliminated from consideration those solutions that aren't as promising. And then the last step in the process is about assessing that landscape of possibility and honing in on that approach which is going to best meet the user needs, which is going to best close the gap in the user experience. So overall, the design process is fundamentally about characterizing the problem, understanding the user needs, and then diverging from that to understand the full space of possibilities, and then entering into a process of convergence in which that space of possibilities is narrowed down to a few great alternatives, to a few great approaches that you can take with the product. Now, we're going to spend the rest of the course really exploring in greater detail those three key steps, but that gives you a sense for what the design process is about.